NPD Project Director at Purdue University, and Jennifer Wren, an Associate Research Scientist also from Purdue University. Let's welcome them and give them our attention to wrap up the day.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Are we hot? Are we hot now? Hello. Now we're live. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon and happy last day of OLA. So my name is Trish Marita Mullaney. I'm an associate professor at Purdue University. And I am the principal investigator on 2 grants, leveraging the Lectura y Parental Understanding of Education in Dual Language, which we're going to talk to you about today. And I'm a product of these NPD grants. I received my master's through these NPD grants, and I'm a recovering bilingual director where I worked with various universities, IUPUI, Indiana University, and Butler University to bring licensure to the teachers in my district. And now I'm on the other end of the continuum as a director of these projects. So my research focuses on several areas. I have a new emerging, well, it's been around for a while, but looking at the policy and educational and language policy dynamics within dual language bilingual education. You'll get to see the sliver of that today. So, and Jen.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for sticking around. We really appreciate it. So I'm Jennifer Wren. I am an associate research scientist at Purdue, and I work with Trish as a senior project manager on the 2 grants that she mentioned, but she neglected to mention that we got a new grant in 2021. So I'm a co-investigator on that one too. I'm a sociolinguist by training. My interests are in language variation, language attitudes and ideologies. And prior to joining Purdue, I was at the Center for Applied Linguistics, and I know some of my Cal pals are here, so it's great to see them.
Cal pals.
Cal pals, yeah.
Cal pals, awesome. I've learned all this new vernacular from Jen. So anyway. So today we're here about examining equity in dual language for emergent bilinguals, trajectories and considerations at the elementary and secondary levels. So let's get started. So this is drawn from a TESOL quarterly issue called Obscuring Equity in Dual Language Bilingual Education, a longitudinal study of emergent bilingual achievement, course placements, and grades. And there's a QR code there. So if you scan that, TESOL Quarterly has opened up this publication to open access for the next 2 months. So you can download it, as many times as you want and share it with your students or whomever would enjoy reading this study. So this is featured in a special issue on equity issues for students learning in dual language bilingual education, which is edited by Dr. Lisa Dorner and Claudia Cervantes-Soon. And Lisa Dorner, who's in the room, where is Lisa? There she is, from the University of Missouri at Columbia, where she is also an investigator on a 2017 project. So, and then also noted, you'll see another name there, Ming Chu. He's our evaluator, and he is based in Hong Kong. And he actually was a colleague with us at Purdue, and he moved. So we moved him to working, instead of a sort of a quasi-external internal evaluator, he became truly an external evaluator, and he has been instrumental in this work. So your collaboration with your evaluators can help you be super productive with your research, particularly as you're getting started, because the program management lift is so heavy. So realize that that's part of why they're on your contract, is to help your research productivity move along. So this is a 2-part study. We are going to share with you briefly about 2 parts. You can read more specifically about part 1 in the International Multilingual Research Journal. And we'll have that link. You'll be able to see all of this in our selected references at the end. So a little bit about terminology. The first is emergent bilingual. Raise your hand if you've heard that terminology before. Okay. So this comes out of the state of New York and Ophelia Garcia's work around calling them emergent bilinguals instead of English learners. So you'll see in our paper that we refer to that because by referencing students in this way, we have more of a heteroglossic framing of who they are. and what they are becoming, and not that they are turning in bilingual children turning into monolinguals. So it's a very heteroglossic definition. So you'll hear that term emergent bilingual. And one of the interesting things is that this term is indeed meant to be for what we know as designated English learners or those that are reclassified. What I find interesting is that some folks that are in programs where you have English majority students, they're starting to take up this term, and that was not the original intent of this naming convention. We're also going to use the term dual language bilingual education. This is also drawn from Ofelia Garcia's work, that this is a form of bilingual education. It's an allowable provision of language education for emergent bilinguals. And we put the term bilingual in there because dual is often a code for who it is for. And usually maybe more privileged communities, language majority communities, which can crowd out emergent bilinguals. And also bilingual education has a very contested history, but nonetheless it belongs in here because dual language education, when we say that, we have to really unpack what that means. So just know that that's the language conventions we'll use. So this is a little overview of what we'll be talking about this afternoon, and we want to be able for you all to engage in questions with us. So we're going to look at the dilemmas and the challenges in dual language bilingual ed, a bit of a lit review, research questions, our conceptual framing, our phase 1 and phase 2 findings, some discussions and limitations of our study, and then I'll call for the field, and then we'll conclude with inviting you to ask questions. So this is the abstract, which is directly drawn from the paper. And so I've highlighted or bolded in big there what we really need to be focusing in on for this particular study. And we use something called the conceptual lens of equity traps. And as we're talking today, I want you to imagine what those potential traps are in the work that you do, whether you're in EL or DLBE spaces. But these are employed to demonstrate how equity is metaphorically trapped within the institutional constraints of schools, specifically master schedules that have courses that range from remedial, low, to advanced. And at the end, we're going to propose a structural matrix that stakeholders can use to examine the equity constraints of dual language bilingual education. All right. So here, let's move to the dilemmas, or what we call the statement of the problem, enduring challenges, however you want to frame it. But DLBE is often heralded as the panacea. You have heard Gandara and Orfield talk about this. We have certainly heard Collier and Thomas talk about this, other scholars in the field, that this is what we need to do in bilingual education for emergent bilinguals. But dual language bilingual education is nested in a very deep socio-political and socio-cultural context that is sometimes impervious to change. And so when we look at newly implementing and scaling dual language bilingual education, there might be issues that attenuate this particular panacea claim. So the dilemmas, I'm going to list them one by one here: school structures and practices, including the master schedule; guidance counselors who arbitrate placements. And I put this in blue for a particular reason, because guidance counselors can be aligned with administration and are they are de facto managers or meso level administrators. And so they align with the demands of the administrator or administrators in the building or the district. Or they can have an orientation of a social worker, where they are more emergent and looking at the immediate needs of the children and the teachers around them. We have leveled and exclusionary tracking, which we'll describe here shortly. There's staffing formulas and practices, right? So those performing arts teachers can be super demanding. Dual language bilingual education is also being used as a mechanism within school choice, a mechanism within magnet and lottery systems to attract and retain particular constituencies within school districts, which is very, very timely, because most school districts in the country, we are in a post-Brown period, and desegregation orders have largely, we've reached unitary status, and so they've concluded. And so because of that, we have that thing called school choice, school competition. And so dual language can be used as a mechanism within this framework. And so there's some things we really need to importantly unpack. And of course, there's the dilemma of funding, whether particular funding is permissible or not. So, and again, this is drawn from the seminal work that Guadalupe Valdez of Stanford said in 1997, the cautionary note concerning the education of language minority students within this type of model. Look out, there are equity traps within. So here are some of the gaps in the research that our study is addressing, is that most dual language bilingual ed programs conclude in the elementary school. Some go on to the secondary level. So for those of you in the room from your states, how many of you have dual language program that matriculate beyond 6th or 7th grade? Okay. And how many of you have programs that only are really K-5, only elementary? Okay. And then others, some are thinking, I'm tired. Okay. Or ask me later. So that's really important to realize, is that most dual language programs only go through the elementary level. And so there is a distal impact that we're often measuring distant from the actual provision of dual language. So, but usually we dismiss some of these trajectories of how students perform over time. So standardized test in English, course grades, their L1 and L2 language development, and even L3 and beyond, right? We also haven't talked a lot about access and or placement to courses, which is often mediated by standardized tests, course grades, which can also mediate whether you're in a remedial or an advanced course. And then also potentially whether you are an EL designated student or not, where your master schedule might be already conceived for you. And then grades, which are subjective, right? And therefore not often studied, but they do have particular weight and can arbitrate where students are placed or not placed. All right. So if we look here, these are the areas that our study's trying to address, the ones with the stars. There's limited to no studies in this area in the context of dual language bilingual education. So the literature review, you all have probably read this before, all of the many benefits of the DLBE model. They're best done if they are done for 6 years or more. You can see some very familiar names such as Thomas and Collier, Lindholm, Leary, and Block. And importantly, so we have the cognitive benefits, we have the dynamic interplay, which attends to academic achievement, particularly done over time, metalinguistic awareness. And if you read any of the websites on dual language across the country, I'm doing a study right now that will be published soon in the current issues of language planning with my colleagues, Garrett Delavan and Juan Ferry, you will learn that this is the most popular content on websites of the 12 largest school districts in the US that do dual language. This is what they talk about, right? So we know that there's other benefits, but these are usually the ones that are marketed. So when we also look at the literature, we see the benefits of bilingualism, and we also see attention to these 3 pillars that were developed by the Center for Applied Linguistics around bilingualism and biliteracy, high academic achievement, and sociocultural competence, right? So those were the original 3 pillars, but since then, there's been an addition of a 4th pillar with Cervantes Soon and others that look at the critical consciousness within dual language bilingual ed, where we look at historicizing bilingual education as very centered on emergent bilinguals, that we look at advocating and disrupting and interrogating power. So that's an addition, and again, that's a centering mechanisms to make sure we don't lose sight of our emergent bilinguals. And also that bottom layer helps us really orient more heteroglossically. So next, we're looking at our conceptual framework of equity traps. So again, these are structural practice and unexamined habits of schooling, including conscious or disconscious consent with historic practices. And this particular framing was actually done in a world language context, and the access or lack of access of African-American youth into world language programming. And they did an unpacking and came up with this term known as equity traps. So in the context of our study, you will see this sort of upside down, this funnel here, where you see advanced courses, which we would hope kids that are in dual language programs, that they have access to those with greater quantity and frequency over time if they're in a dual language program, and that situates them for post-secondary success. And then we hope that equity will come out of that. But problematically, we have this thing called school structures and practices, the master's schedule, other logics among different educators that may conceivably trap this equity. And so that's what we're really trying to unpack and understand more deeply within our context.
Okay, so as Trish mentioned, this is a two-phase study. So we have 3 research questions. The first is from phase 1. And we ask, how do the English language and math achievements of emergent bilingual students in ESL and dual language bilingual education programs in grades 3 through 6 differ across time? And then the next 2 questions are from phase 2. So the first is, how do the course placements and performances of emergent bilinguals in ESL and DLBE programs in middle school, which for us was grades 7 and 8, differ? And how do course placements differ among emergent bilinguals in ESL and DLBE programs, impact their opportunities to take advanced level core and elective courses? Because we wanted to look beyond simply the typical outcomes that have been assessed. We used a longitudinal quantitative design over 4 years for phase 1, and then we followed those same students for an additional 2 years in phase 2. We followed 162 emergent bilingual students. 26 were in dual language bilingual education, and 136 were in an English as a second language or ESL program. Our setting is the Serendipitous School District, which is an urban fringe district. It has a K-12 dual language program. Within the district, 28% of the students are designated as English learners. 48.6% are Hispanic, and 47.5% are low SES. So let's look at phase 1, which focuses on achievement outcomes via standardized tests. Everyone's favorite. So how did we start? Well, as Trish mentioned, there is some research on the benefits of dual language bilingual education, and Collier and Thomas is probably among the most famous. They have shown that there are positive outcomes for emergent bilinguals who participate in this type of program. And they have shown that those benefits persist beyond elementary school. However, they've only been able to look at this in an elementary only dual language bilingual education context. So we wondered, could we find a similar pattern in our district of study? And also, what can we say, because we are able to go beyond elementary school and see what kinds of outcomes will we see into middle school. All right, so this is a snapshot of our students. We wanted to make sure the 2 groups were not different in any important ways, and as you can see, they really weren't. So with gender, both groups were about 50-50 male-female. ESL, among the ESL students, 7% were in special education, 3% of the dual language students. Free and reduced lunch benefits were given to now 97% of the ESL students and all of the dual language students. Within the ESL program, 92% of students spoke Spanish and 100% of the dual language students spoke Spanish. Looking at race, the vast majority, 93% were Hispanic, though the ESL program also had a few other groups. So there were a few Asian, Black, White, and Native American students in that program. 100% of the dual language students were Hispanic. And in both groups, about 4% identified as immigrants. We did test to make sure those differences were not statistically significant, and they were not. So to analyze the data, we employed a multivariate outcome 2-level cross-classification analysis on student outcome data from English language arts and math exams for the 162 emergent bilinguals across both programs. So we were looking at the state mandated content area tests. Test scores in ELA and math were collected longitudinally over the course of 4 academic school years for the 162 students from grades 3 through 6. Okay, so I know it's late, so I'm going to orient you to our line graph here. So the blue line is dual language bilingual education. The red dot, our dashed line, is the average scores for ESL students. There's also a gray dot. That is the pass score. So that's basically what the state sets as the cut score for proficiency. And then the open circle is the pass plus score, and that designates high achieving students. So starting with grade 3, we can see that on average, the dual language scores were actually below the ESL student scores. The ESL student scores were right in line with that cut score for passing. In grade 4, the dual language students have surpassed the ESL students on average, though both groups are below the pass cut score. But in grades 5 and 6, we see that gap continuing to grow between dual language and ESL, and the dual language students are above that pass score. In math, we see a very, very similar pattern. Both groups are at almost exactly the same score on average in grade 3. In grade 4, we see that widening gap with dual language above the pass score and ESL below the pass score, and that persists through grades 5 and 6. So looking at our regression results, we found initially there was no significant difference between English language arts and math scores based on program type, which looking here at grades 3, not surprising, they're very similar. But when we looked at the growth over time, we found that there was a test score advantage for dual language students over ESL students that increased with grade, and it was statistically significant. For math, we saw a similar pattern. However, that increase over time was not statistically significant. So what does that mean? Right. So basically what it means is that we can say that with confidence that participation of EL designated students in dual language is associated with higher English language arts scores in our district of study. For math, we don't have enough evidence to say that there's an association between dual language and higher math scores in our district, but a lot of that is probably due to our sample size. As you may recall, we only had 26 dual language students in our study, so it's actually kind of amazing that we had statistical significance for English. All right, and Trish is going to talk about the wonderful world of course placements.
Dun, dun, dun. Okay. So one of the first things that we did, and this was really at the onset of our NPD project in 2017, but was learning the logics of the master schedule. So as a recovering bilingual director, I was very familiar with this particular image. How many of you have seen this before? Okay, this is a master schedule. It's under lock and key in a boardroom in the local high school. The only people allowed in there are the principal, the head of guidance, and the department chairs. And usually February, March, this thing starts to be built for the next school year. And these are on a magnets and things get moved around, and each department comes in with their faculty at a designated time, and they begin to move around the map who's going to teach what, when, and where. And so you can see what this looks like. So this is I almost feel like it's sort of like Pentagon type security clearance to be able to see the master schedule. But I have seen it before, and I tried to joke and move a magnet, and then I was told that I should not do that. So anyway, so what's interesting about this, though, is that computers can now do this for us, right? We can plug this all in and it can be generated. But schools are very unmoving and reproductive spaces. And so this is a system that works for them. And so this board doesn't change substantively over time, right? So there's some ideological reasons that people keep sort of this old school methodology in place, is because they want it to be maybe an incremental change, but not a substantive change. And if they did use the computer, they could probably have new imaginations around this. But anyway, here is the master schedule. So if you're in a school, in a high school around March, go find the boardroom. Let me know how it goes. So guidance counselors are the principal architects of the master schedule. And again, I alluded to that guidance counselors are often meso-level administrators, or they can be social workers, right? So, but they are charged with putting this very complicated matrix together. And they work in coordination with their principals to identify courses by level. Are they going to be remedial, super low, basic, or maybe general, or advanced? So this might be advanced placement, honors, lyceum. You probably have different vernacular in your context. The time of the day, right? Beginning, middle, or end of the day. I know that a lot of teachers who are coaches, they like to have their schedule they like to be done by 1 o'clock so they can get the team on the bus. And performing arts, same sort of scenario. And so there's this negotiation that goes on to determine those things that aren't always centered on the lives of children. Shocking. Okay, staffing. Who's going to teach remedial? Who's going to teach basic or advanced courses? And again, at what interval of the day? So in looking at my field notes, this is before our collection even started, was to talk with the guidance counselor at the middle school. And so this is sort of a narrative. It's not her precise words. I cleaned it up because I wanted it to make sense to you. So this is kind of how it goes. So the counselor's on the left. We have 3 different types of language arts course, and she's talking about English language arts, but a lot depends on the master's schedule and how everything fits into their other courses. And then I say, what about English learners? Which type of language arts classes are they in? Usually they're in the remedial one, some in the basic one. Remedial is lowest, but if they're in ESL courses, they get an additional dose of language arts, right? Sounds like medicine. Their test scores tend to be lower. Could they take a more advanced language arts course? Is that ever possible? Well, it's complicated, but I've talked with the EL team and they support this approach, right? So this is interesting. Sometimes our own field can be problematic arbiters in this process. For our 8th graders, their EL course is during the same time as the advanced level language arts course, right? So we see the ideologies of placement, but we also see just the sheer management of it conflicts with ESL, and ESL trumps the advanced language arts class. Let's see here. I got one more slide, right? Okay. So this is where I'm going to review the literature for part 2 of the study. So we have 2 types of tracking. So exclusionary tracking is tracking based on someone's designation. So this could be special education. It could be English learner in our case. So it prescribes their course placements. So if there is a special education student who has a specific learning disability, their schedule is very set at the secondary level, and the same may be the case for EL designated students. And oftentimes the courses that are demarked as ESL courses are really ideologically and descriptively defined as remedial in nature. There's also leveled tracking, right? So this has to do with your historic achievement, your performance on subject area grades, and it might even be based on quarterly assessments that are done by the district. And this can dictate particular course placements. And then, of course, there's course grades, which we know are very subjective. So they tend to be that tends to be understudied because there's such great variance. But grades in electives or core content that might be remedial, basic, or advanced impact school and or course placements. So not just within a school, it might even determine what school you're allowed to go to. So it can even be at that macro level.
Okay, and in order to identify the types of tracking that were going on in our district of study, we coded the data. So to identify cases of exclusionary tracking, we coded all participants as designated ELs to see if there were any types of exclusion toward those students. To identify level tracking, we coded courses as remedial, basic, or advanced. We also coded courses as core content or electives, including ESL or dual language course placements. And then we looked at course grades in relationship to course designations of basic, remedial, advanced, and student type to look for cases of exclusionary tracking. All right, for our data analysis, we initially used a multivariate, multi-level cross-classification to test an explanatory model for level of major courses. So again, that's basic or remedial, basic, or advanced, and 2 measures of performance, which were final grade and pass-fail. Then we added a vector of variables to look at the semester of the course. So we looked at spring 2018, fall 2018, and looked at those against a baseline of fall 2017. And finally, tested interactions among those variables. In our final structural equation model, which you'll get to see, don't worry, I'll show it to you. The significant variables and interactions were used. I know I love in a structural equation model at the end of the day. Yeah,
Sounds right.
it's good. No. So looking at our overall results, first, in terms of course type, we found that across all EL designated students, so both dual language and ESL, they took mostly major courses. So about 2/3 of their courses were major content areas. They took some electives, about 26%, and then 7% were other non-major required courses. In terms of course leveling, we found that across the major courses taken by EL designated students, 6% were remedial, the vast majority, 75% were basic, 15.5% were advanced, and 3% earned high school credit while in middle school, so we also coded those as advanced. Less than 7% of their electives were advanced. And looking at grades, students passed more than 88% of their courses, and their final grade across all courses was an average of B-. So here's the promised SEM model. And the thing to keep in mind, I know it's late, and if you're not an evaluator, you're probably like, why? But so I'm gonna explain to you what it means, right? So basically what this does is it shows us relationships between program type, the semester, and the subject, and outcomes. So again, we're looking at the course level, basic, remedial, basic, advanced. We're looking at final grades, and we're looking at whether they passed. So let's go through step by step and look at each outcome in turn. If this works. There we go. All right. So first, we found that emergent bilinguals in the dual language program had higher grades compared to their ESL counterparts. That was especially true in a particular course in the fall of 2018 in science. The dual language students did significantly better than their ESL counterparts. Dual language students were also more likely to pass their courses. And in math, dual language students were more likely to take a higher level, so a basic or advanced level course compared to ESL students. Now, looking across all of the EL designated students, so both ESL and emergent bilinguals, we saw certain patterns. So we found that across those students that they were less likely as a group to take a major course level, a higher level in math compared to other content areas. In English language arts, their grades tended to be slightly lower than other subject areas. But in science, they were more likely to pass compared to other subject areas. See, so it's not that scary, right? And looking at grades, overall, emergent bilinguals in dual language programs had a higher GPA than those in ESL programs. So the dual language average was 2.85 compared to 2.62 for ESL students. Emergent bilinguals in dual language programs, however, were less likely than students in ESL programs to take remedial courses. So this is where I think it's really important to be delving into more than just GPA and looking at overall outcomes and getting into the nuances and the details. So most emergent bilinguals in the ESL program took at least one advanced elective course, right? Those courses are more difficult, so they received lower grades in those courses than in other courses. Right, that's in contrast to the dual language students, where 93% did not take any advanced electives, which tend to yield lower grades. And so that helps elevate their GPA, right? So you have to do a little more than scratch the surface to see what's going on. So what we're seeing is that grades may be lower for emergent bilinguals who are in ESL programs, but they have greater access to advanced level electives. And those are the kinds of electives that do set the stage for college and career readiness in many cases. So for example, one common one within our district of study was called Project Lead the Way, which was an advanced science elective that was taken by many of the ESL students, but not the dual language students.
All right. So let's take a look at our discussion. So what we learned is emergent bilinguals experience forms of leveled and exclusionary tracking within dual language bilingual education and have less access to course electives, including advanced electives. So a lot of the studies that have been done on tracking have looked at core courses like science, social studies, math, and language arts, but not electives. And Project Lead the Way, we found, was a big lever of setting stage for a high school schedule that would be regarded as college and career ready. So this is how we're going to make sense of this. So on the left, you can see students who are identified, let's see here. Okay, the ones on the left would be designated designated English learners, and this is an example, or not, they're not in a dual language program. So this would be an example of what their schedule would look like. So think of this as a language majority schedule, right? So we'll see here that the first three are very similar, and R being remedial, B being basic, A being advanced. You can see the first three. All students take those and have equal access to those first three. But when we get down to 4 and 5, things begin to change if you are designated within a dual language program. And you can see the language of instruction, and you can see the designation of the course. So we can see here that language majority students, English majority speakers, they have a full repertoire of access to remedial, basic, or advanced, whereas those in the dual language program, those courses are identified as basic and not advanced. All right, so do you see that? How there is a difference in the categorization of these courses, right? Which has long-term impacts. So we then look at elective number 1, a language majority student gets to take BAN, whereas a student in a dual language program is starting to take their Spanish language arts class, which is a basic class. Whereas there are basic and advanced level courses for an elective for a student who might be taking a foreign language, right? But interestingly, they could get advanced credit and even high school credit for taking foreign language. But in this particular context, the students are only getting basic credit for Spanish language arts. Elective 2, you can see the same pattern here where we see basic and advanced availed to language majority students, whereas emergent bilinguals in a dual language program are in a remedial or a basic designation because of what we call exclusionary tracking. So you see here that that is framed in that way. And then lastly, third elective for a language majority student, and there is only room for one elective, right? So part of this is an argument of how we tag classes, but it's also an argument of just simple, there's just not time in the day, and also how we categorize courses, right? So you can see here that students on the left there, they get 3 electives. Whereas a designated emergent bilingual or a designated English learner in a dual language bilingual ed program has 1 to 2 electives. And as we learned, they are very capable of performing well in science courses and performed well in that area, yet they were not really placed on Project Lead the Way. And so what that means is as they matriculate into high school, their schedule does not look as rosy as we had hoped. So some of the limitations, our sample size is tiny. It's very small. This group was originally 50 kids starting in kindergarten. There's great attrition. We need to examine why that is, but a larger sample size would help us provide us with greater evidence over time. Also, this is a limitation and a consistent critique of Collier and Thomas's work is that we have selection bias in dual language bilingual ed. These are not typically in neighborhood schools. Students are going to places all over the community to come to these programs. And it does not, again, reflect the local constituency. And so this is where we have to be really careful when we do this type of longitudinal work. And sadly, most designated English learners are not in dual language bilingual ed programs. They are rather focused as a default in ESL focused models. And so there really is unequal access. So of the 534 emergent bilinguals that are participating in our 40 dual language bilingual ed programs in Indiana, that's a tiny proportion of those that are eligible. So those are some things we need to really think about. So this is our 3A matrix, and this is the achievement, access, and assessment, which were the three constructs that we analyzed and unpacked. And so this is a heuristic to help leaders in EL and bilingual education, in dual language bilingual education, guidance counselors, administrators to really unpack this with their educators, their families, and their students. And so you can see the overlap. And so if achievement is high or low, then course placement is. If course placement is high or low, then achievement is. And by working really methodically about this, that people can create a portrait of what the constituency of emergent bilinguals looks like in a dual language program versus an ESL model, right? To really, really unpack that. And I think one of the biggest takeaways is just schedule your emergent bilinguals first. Could we just start there and create the schedule around them instead of doing it the other way around? So, and this is what we call centering in bilingual education. So our next steps is to look at standardized test scores and other core subject areas besides language arts and math. And also taking these kids through high school. These kids, I believe, are seniors or have graduated last year. Looking at their grades across all of their courses in high school, examining their Spanish proficiency. Did they get the certificate of multiliteracy, which for us is the seal of biliteracy, which we're learning the most of the kids that get that in our state are not emergent bilinguals. What type of diploma are they getting? There is we have leveled tracking with leveled designations of particular diplomas. And what are their college and career trajectories? What are they doing? Have they moved on to post-secondary education? And then also expanding this across newer destination locations. Indiana is a newer locale for the emergent bilingual community. And a lot of the studies, those that we cited, have been done in historic destination states where there is very ironclad language policy, where we are more emerging in our understanding and development of that. So here's our call to the field, right? So selection bias is likely given the expansion of dual language bilingual and is being used as an attractor within the school choice movement. And it's also a mechanism used to elevate the status of a given school or district. So we need to really recognize that reality and how this can be problematic in the ways that we talk and discuss the needs and the rights of our emergent bilinguals. And then we need to identify the different equity traps. We really just looked at a sliver of what those are within our local context, because your context might be similar, but there's differences, right? Those of us in new destination states, historic destination states, rural communities, right? But we need to take a look at that to see if our local context may be foreclosing on the ascribed benefits of a dual language bilingual education program. And you can use our 3A matrix as a starting point. So this is a way to historicize and localize, which goes back to that fourth pillar of critical consciousness and dual language bilingual education. And then again, centering, right? Center and schedule emergent bilinguals first. So essential elements of equity are foregrounded instead of obscured or backgrounded or trapped, as we found in our study. So now we are done and it's early, and we would like to ask if you have any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I was asking about the Spanish because it seemed odd that a Spanish for immersion middle school students would be listed as basic when they have an advanced Spanish for the non-immersion students that would probably be at a much lower level.
Yeah, so I think part of this is that there's sort of a contested, in this particular context, right? The immersion program was originally a one-way immersion program just for language majority students, and the kids were actually crowded out. And it converted to more of a two-way dual language bilingual model over time. And so part of the reason that it's identified as basic versus advanced is because they're peculiarly arbitrated as a sort of a cachet of gifted and talentedness. And because they have that title, they sort of sit on somewhat of an eggshell status. And so that was their way to arbitrate it. So we do want to share these findings with our guidance counselors, but COVID, so it didn't happen. But to me, that's a very simple conversation. It's sort of a no-brainer.
I have a question from the same slide. So the students who you considered as your, or who you counted the N of 26, your emergent bilinguals from the dual language program, were they any students who entered the dual language program with a different home language than English? Or were they students who were, so were they students, any student with a home language of Spanish, or were they any students who were still categorized as ESL by the district's testing that they do year after year?
Yeah, so within the 26 dual language students, they were all Spanish speakers as their home language. Yeah, there was 100% Spanish. Within the ESL group, there was, I think, 5% spoke another language, but for dual language, it was solely Spanish.
So what I'm getting at is, do you know like their WIDA or LPAS or TELPAS or whatever, ELPT, whatever district, state, whatever English language proficiency test your state uses to determine if someone is still categorized as an English learner or not? Were those students, because they were in this ESL mandatory elective, so I guess I'm wondering, did they even need it?
Well, I think that was an example schedule that Trish created. So all of those students weren't receiving additional ESL services, but some do. And so I think you're just kind of show that like worst case scenario is that they're in the dual language courses and then have ESL on top of it. So then they don't have time for electives. But I don't know if you want to speak more to that.
No, I think that's good.
Yeah.
But we didn't measure the English language proficiency, right? We do have that data, but that was not within the scope of our study. So that's, part two.
Next,
Part three, sorry.
Thank you, Trish and Jen. I love hearing the details of your study. It just reminds me of several complicating factors that tie into policy, right? The course placement in advanced, basic, or remedial void of Spanish language testing is unconscionable in a lot of ways, right? They're basing their placement on English only in content area classes. So I know you know these things. I'm just saying that these are the things that you have me thinking about. We also have a problem in the state of Indiana that many teachers who teach English language learners aren't certified. So that's another complicating factor in those outcomes. Not to insult the teachers who are doing it, but there is a benefit to actual certification. But the thing I think all of us wish those are our state problems. And then we completely ignore guidance counselors and that, but then even administrators, like how can you be an administrator in a majority minority school setting without certification? So I think your paper points to lots of policy changes at the national level that would bolster and improve the quality of outcomes for those learners. So thanks for drawing attention to that. I mean, I know you have opinions on administrators as well, so.
Oh, yes, I do. I'm a
O-
former
Open,
one, so I'm
open,
fogging
open
myself.
mic.
Yeah, open mic, right? So a couple of things. Yeah, administrators definitely need training, guidance counselors need training, teachers need training. And I think what's really interesting is that the understanding of dual language is more that you have a basic license and a content area or elementary education, and you're bilingual, and then you're qualified. And so a lot of times what you have is there's a paradigm of world language. A lot of dual language teachers, when programs are getting started, are recruited from the world language field. And so their orientation is not around content area learning. It's around sort of oftentimes a very much an IRE, stand and deliver audiolingual methodology, which is problematic when we're looking at developing literacy across multiple languages. So yes, there is work to be done, but interestingly, the scope of this particular project, Project Puede, we found that in our districts of focus, that in the dual language program, which hosted, a large number of emergent bilinguals, nearly half their building, and had the most, hefty Latino workforce, I learned that 32% of them were not certified, period. Like not certified at all. They had bachelor's degrees, but were on emergency permits. And that was for a variety of reasons. Second, that only 3 people in the building actually had EL training, right? So that's something too, right? You have an EL program where they are trained and they may or may not have licensure, but you have dual language teachers, which become really the substitutes oftentimes for ESL programming, but they are not necessarily well trained and equipped. And I think this is a really distinct challenge in new destination locations that are firing up this particular model. They're not thinking about the preparation. They pretty much are thinking in parallels, right? So we have an English curriculum just converted into Spanish, just converted into Mandarin, and that they're mirrors of each other. And that's a very, very flawed argument, but it's very real.
Okay, in your definition, well, my assumption is that when we talk about dual language programming, we're talking about programs that mature the students over several years. And so if it's in a middle school, you can assume they've been receiving dual language services that are in your study for at least 4 or 5 years. Is that correct? Is that also true of the students that were in your study of the English learners that only received ESL services? Had they been receiving them for that long?
Yeah.
Or were they
So it's like a
reclassified?
survival analysis. So we looked at kids that had consecutive data points. So if we had loss, like a kid, like I told you that the group originally started as 50 emergent bilinguals in the dual language program, and then, ended up with, almost half of that. Yeah, in kindergarten. So when we were looking at grades 3, 4, and 5 at the elementary, we ensured that they had 3 points of data. And if they dropped out of the dual language program or moved away or whatever, if we had attrition, so we ensured that they had consecutive data points. So.
And for the ESL service only students, were any of them reclassified during the course of your longitudinal study? So they're not in your study analysis?
We didn't look at that very closely, but I think the answer is yes. That's part 4. You're giving us some new ideas.
Okay. Then I have another question. I know that when I've looked at models of dual language, that there is a really popular 50-50 model that proposes that math always be only taught in English. And I'm wondering if that also was part of the phenomenon that you looked at, like were the students that they did score better in, or there were no differences between math? Was it because math had always been taught to them in English, or was there something else in play?
Go ahead.
I think in this particular district, I don't think that math was taught in English only until 3rd grade. when then at that point it was taught in English only because then that's when testing starts. So I know that is something that is on the minds of the administrators in that district, is making sure students score well on their state standardized tests. But I believe that they do, because it's a 90-10-ish model starting in kindergarten. And in fact, in the fall, in the fall of this kindergarten year, it's 100% Spanish. So they do get some math instruction in the early grades, but then they do switch.
Thank you so much for your research, and I have a lot of questions, but I'm just going to ask one real quick. Really interested to see how some of these students fare over time, but sticking to this particular time period, I was wondering if you have examined or have considered the effects of dual language on ESL students themselves. In Texas, people have done some studies that look at the spillover effect of having bilingual dual language education for students who are not part of that kind of experience, and those students also feeling some boosting effects of just being in the environment, school environment during recess and other kinds of experiences where they themselves also benefit from being around folks who are playing with language and things like that. So just wondering whether you're looking at the effects on ESL students as well.
Yeah, so that's not something we've yet examined. So that's part 5. So we're writing this all down. But I think you're really addressing that fourth, the third and fourth pillar of dual language bilingual education, the sociocultural competence and the critical consciousness, and that there are benefits for language majority students, but more importantly, who we're worried about, emergent bilingual youth, and that some of the complexities of dual language are that there are gates in dual language. We're learning in schools that have strands that the people that are not doing dual language are the general education teachers, and they experience great mobility, whereas the dual language bilingual education teachers can crowd out and say, oh no, they're after first grade, they're not eligible, they can't come in, they're not proficient enough, or they don't speak a particular variety of a particular Spanish. And so there are gates put in place. And so that's what we call, one narrow door in, many wide doors out. In dual language bilingual ed. And so we need to, the fact that there's only half of our cohort left from kindergarten to the time of our study is really telling, right? So why did they depart the program? It could be that they left the district, but are there other compelling reasons that they maybe left the program, right? So yeah, to be determined. Go ahead.
And actually, your question makes me think this isn't something we've looked at in the context of our study, but anecdotally with our partner districts, in schools where there are dual language strands, I feel like we have seen cases where the presence of that strand has created more discussion and more just presence of multilingualism and heteroglossic ideologies. But in other programs, there's been sort of a feeling of the dual language kids are isolated. Like the dual language kids are always together. They don't interact with the other kids on the playground. They're sort of a cohort that continues together, and they are on an island. So I feel like in our context really matters. And I think a lot of that has to do with administration and how much they support the dual language program and see it as being part of the greater school community rather than being its own like little island.
So speaking to that, one of the things that I know we've been doing in Louisiana with a lot of schools, charter schools and school districts, is creating immersion sites where every single student in that school is immersion. And that I don't know if that's something that they have in Indiana. I don't know, because are they all track schools? They're all like one track within the school?
Serendipitous district, there is one building that is, the whole building is a dual language bilingual education program. The whole building, K6.
Okay, so they do have an entire school.
Entire school, and they're scaling it, but scaling is really interesting, right? And it's really fascinating to find out what formulas and algorithms get applied to why that is done or not done. So, but yeah, but it is possible, right? But it often relies a lot on interest convergence in order for you to get to that stage, and or grassroots movements from your emergent bilingual communities that are asking for it. So,
Thank you.
You have 30 seconds.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for this work. I just think it's really important. So thank you. This has been a great presentation.
so Pam said wrap up, and we're wrapping it up. Happy trails, everybody. Thank you.
So everyone, as you leave DC, I want you all to leave with one piece of good news. We just got a notification that Ketanji Brown has been confirmed by the Senate. All done. So we have our first female Black Supreme Court judge. So yes.
Just a moment. I want to just say again, thank you to Trish and Jen for presenting on their study. The link, she had it up on the screen, but on their PowerPoint, the last page, there's a QR code where you can download their study. It's free through TESOL. And again, just want to let you know that all the recordings and the PowerPoints will be loaded to the KMS in approximately 4 weeks. And the app will have all of the presentations available for the next 30 days for you to download. And just thank you so much for taking the time to come across the country for our 2022 NPD Project Directors Meeting. It has been an absolute pleasure to host you. We hope you're leaving with some new information and invigorated in your work. And safe travels home, everyone. Thank you so much.